Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Council for today's conversation, an exciting launch of the report featuring a number of our non-resident fellows and partners on the stage, digital identities and border cultures. I'm excited to host this conversation and encourage everyone to check out the related report. Today, we are treated first to introductory remarks from Ambassador Anne-Marie Engtoft-Melgaard. Afterwards, we will get a briefing from Nanjala Nyabola, the report author, on the report itself, and then we will have a lively conversation with an expert panel on the topic. Before we kick off, a reminder that this will be available on our website, as will the report. We encourage you to follow along and share widely. However, I'm very excited to turn first to Ambassador Engtoft-Melgaard, who, in addition to leading the Danish government's work on digital diplomacy and tech issues around the world, has been a close partner and ally to many in the community working on issues of human rights and democracy, technology, and innovation that leads to a better world. Thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Rose. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It is my distinct pleasure to be here with all of you, and I want to start by congratulating Nanjala and DFR and Atlantic Council on a very important and very timely report on an issue that I believe too often is overlooked, but it's really at the core of whether we are going to be successful in creating a human-centered and a meaningful digital revolution for everyone. Denmark is very delighted to support the work that led to this report and to shed light on the dilemmas and the difficulties of technology applications, particularly in vulnerable contexts and with regards to migration. With an estimated 3.6% of the world's population on the move in 2021, and the outlook for both 2022 and 2023, and not least 2024, looks to be in the same high range, if not even higher, we must be very carefully when considering how, when, and where we deploy technology in a migration context. I believe that technology can be supportive. Identifying migrant patterns to help ensure humanitarian support is available and at all times, to empower migrants with better access to information, to uphold rights through digital means, and not least to connect to family and friends. But as the report very rightly points out, migration is not a technology problem. And believing so will lead us down a wrong path where technosolutionism, which I think is so important that the report highlights, might end up providing a more dystopian future than we want. Earlier this year, I was in New York for the UN General Assembly, and it was clear that across the Sustainable Development Goals, and not least when it comes to migration, there's a deep belief and an eagerness that we can harness new and emerging technologies, especially AI, to solve global challenges. As one of the most digitized countries, as a Dane, I believe I've seen so myself that you can use technology to deliver better welfare, better economies, better societies. However, we are also very much cognizant that most of the problems in today's world, they're not technological problems. They are deeply rooted political, economic, social challenges. And as such, we need to address them with that political, economic, and social innovation. But for that, technology can be a powerful tool if we use it in the right way and in collaboration with the very people who are on the move. It is also important that we understand the shadow sides, that there is a tendency, and I think to some maybe it is too tempting to use technology to control, to suppress, to surveil because it is easy. But that is not the right way to do it. In a world full of conflict and where the context gets more unpredictable, using technology in the right way is not only about upholding the human rights for the individual, but collectively to secure the global trust in technology that it can be a powerful tool for betterment rather than the opposite. I believe that when we talk about identities, so in my own country, we have a national electronic ID, a digital identity, and it serves as the foundation for the digitization of the public sector and for deliver better services. A key priority has been a responsible integration of technology in collaboration between public and private entities to ensure that digital public services are safe, they're inclusive, they are accessible. For digital identities, that means trusting the government who issue the papers, that the data is governed in a rights-respecting manner, and most importantly, that it preserves privacy. And we recognize that what might work here won't work everywhere. So when we do policy, and whether that is in Denmark or the EU, it is important that we make sure that these laws are not just about protecting people that are in the near vicinity of where we are, but that have a global impact on the rest of the world, and as such need to also uphold rights. I believe that the work of this report and the following conversation, which I am delighted to be listening into and learning from, can shed light on what are the dilemmas as we're doing so, and how do we think about a responsible manner for harnessing the powerful and incredible tools at our disposal, but not in a way that it is harming the people who are already most at risk, particularly migrants in today's world. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. Again, thank you to the Atlantic Council for the important work in this, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that extremely helpful launch pad for this conversation. I'm excited to pass here in a moment to Nanjala Nyabola, who is a senior non-resident fellow with our program at the Democracy and Tech Initiative, as well as a renowned Kenyan scholar focused on technology and democracy globally. I encourage you to check out her many books on everything from technology and democracy issues in her home country of Kenya to traveling and the musings on a wide range of issues. Before I pass to Nanjala, I want to say just that our program is focused on questions of how how technology is funded, built, and governed, and how that impacts the long-term viability of democracy and human rights globally. I say that because we view all of these issues as deeply interconnected, built on an internet that is in fact systemic, which means even if you don't care about what is happening somewhere else in the world, the issues that manifest online in one place will inevitably become issues that impact you in your own home. And so we are lucky to have scholars like Nanjala, part of our community, helping us understand what we're missing and how to think as a global community about the internet, digital tools, and the world that we want. The report that Nanjala wrote was supported by the Danish government, and our program was focused on ensuring that the global conversation would reflect all of these insights. And so just a thank you to Nanjala for putting the work in and being here today. Can you share what everyone can expect when they dig in and read every single word of that report, as I'm sure they will do after this?
As people are generally known to do. Thank you so much, Rose, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to everyone who is here. Thank you to the ambassador for that very generous and really important framing for the conversation that we're about to have here today. I want to begin by just putting on the table that, first of all, this is the bulk of it is theoretical work. It's work that tries to bring together different ideas from different areas of practice. These are areas of practice that are interesting to me, and not just like intellectually interesting, but also just politically interesting. I think they represent some of the most urgent questions about our global society. Who are we when we are facing a population that does not have power, that is not adequately represented in our political structures? Who are we when we have to make really important decisions about how we're going to protect people who are not necessarily integrated into our political cultures and our political systems? So it's very much a work of theory that tries to address some of these really urgent political questions about populations, managing populations that are on the move, but also at heart democracy and the space that technology will play in our democracies. I think so often when we think about democracy, we tend to collapse on formal institutions. We tend to think about elections and the election process, and we think about representative politics. But democracy, as we've learned very keenly in the last 3 years, I would say, maybe not learned, but been reminded, is something that occurs within a context. And the fundamental premise in this work is really that who we are when we are dealing with vulnerable populations is a litmus test of the state of democracy and society at large. who we are when we are dealing with refugee populations who maybe we don't necessarily owe anything in our more formal understanding of democracy, but do owe something as part of this shared planet, as part of a shared humanity. Who we are in those moments, I think, is a litmus test of the health of our democracies and the health of the conversations that we're able to have, and the way that we're able to incorporate people into our society. So that's like the foundational premise. It was an intellectual work that was trying to see, well, where are these questions about democracy most stark? Where is the dilemma, as the master put it together? Because it is a dilemma. There is no easy answer. Where is the dilemma most stark? Who is the most likely to be affected by some of these retreats in democracy that we're witnessing and living through? And what are the responses that have been underway so far? How are they limited? And how can there be a course correction if one is needed? And that's why the idea of technosolutionism. It's a portmanteau. It's a new word. I'm not the one who came up with it, but it's basically this idea, as the ambassador said, we look at the dilemma of managing populations on the move, and instead of grappling with the deeper questions about integration, about safety, about providing services outside, formal institutions, of just protecting lives, we decide to collapse on the use of technology, the uncritical use of technology to address these dilemmas. And this is generally, primarily in the form of surveillance technology. It's about controlling how people are able to move in the society. The very first example that I give is the use of ankle bracelets, ankle monitors on refugee populations. And this is technology that was developed to deal with prisoners. And so this criminalization of mobility, instead of dealing with the emerging population movements and the new population movements and the very risky movements that people are taking, we criminalize it wholesale. And what does that then do to the population by extension? What does that do to the rest of us? Who are we as a population that criminalizes human mobility in such stark ways? And so it was really exploring the theories. What would a theoretical framework for technosolutionism in this day and age look like? And that's one of the things, the dilemmas that the paper engages with and invites people to sit with. Are we asking the harder questions, or are we using technology to take the easy way out? And so that if we don't have to look at refugees, if they are on a boat somewhere offshore, if they are in detention centers offshore, then we don't have to think about some of these deeper questions about providing services, about inclusion, about integration, and all of that. So that was the first big idea. The second big idea is this idea of border cultures, and really looking again at the border, starting with that premise of where are these questions most stark? Where are the questions about the nature of the state most stark? It's not with the people who are at the center of a society, who have the most access to protection, who have the most access to the mechanisms of the state. It's actually where we are all most vulnerable, when it's the question about admission and rejection, where the state can really impose its power. And I really wanted to explore the border, both as a physical site and as an imagined site. Because what technology has done is that it's made the border very portable. If you are a foreigner in a country that issues biometric, identity cards or biometric visas, the border basically follows you around wherever you are in the country. If you are thinking about the externalization of borders, and I think Petra will talk a little bit about this, there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done on how EU borders are externalized in other territories, because people are performing border work. If you just take an example, if you go to the airport in Nairobi, you will have to do a passport check, a visa check, at least 4 times before you get on the plane, right? That is not being done on behalf of the Kenyan government. That's being done on behalf of the country that you're going to, either the United States or whatever EU country that you're going to. And that is an externalization of border work. And so I really wanted to use this idea of border cultures to unite these theoretical concepts. So thinking about what technosolutionism looks like at the border, because again, this is where we see the dilemmas at their most stark. This is where nation states have to make the decision about how do we treat people who are coming into our countries? How do we make the decisions about who is admissible and who is not admissible? And there are many instances that we've seen in the last 10 years that have shown us how fickle the presumptions that we make about the nature of the border can be. We're talking about the so-called Muslim ban, right? This is something that would have been incomprehensible as a human rights issue for most of us until it actually happened. And then it's like, now who is the United States in this context as a nation that can ban 6 nationalities, at one go? And what are the mechanisms that are being used to enforce this ban? What are the mechanisms that are being used to address it? So it's really exploring the theoretical idea of border cultures. I think one of the key texts that I use in this analysis is one that tells us that border cultures are really the product of the state culture itself, how the state thinks about issues of carcerality, prisons and imprisonment, right? That is projected onto the border, how it thinks about racialized violence, who should be subjected to certain kinds of violence and who should not be subjected to certain kinds of violence. So I really wanted to put that on the table as a key piece of theoretical work to help us understand how technosolutionism works at the border. And the final theoretical context is the idea of digital identities. And today, in almost every society in the world, there are some kinds of digital identities in play. Some of them are things that we make ourselves. We decide our avatars, who we are online. We decide what our social media profiles are going to be like, how we present in the digital era. And then some of them are things that are built for us, either by the state, when you are issued with a digital ID card, when you're issued with a social security card. Nowadays, we're getting all of these they call them 360 ID systems, whereby a single source of truth identity functions across multiple platforms. It is your ability to freedom of movement within the country, but it's also whatever allows you to access banking, to access your pension, etc. So these are also digital identities. It's just that they are crafted by the state system, and they're becoming much more normalized, not just in wealthy countries. They're becoming normalized everywhere. So the report really tries to link these 3 schools of thought, which honestly are occurring within sort of disparate disciplines. And that is really more of a reflection of how I work, which is trying to think interdisciplinary way, and trying to weave together the law and political science and refugee studies and all of these amazing schools of thought that are happening, and people are doing really urgent and important work. But do policymakers know that all of these things read sort of across these imagined boundaries of thought? Do they know that, people who are working in refugee and migration studies have done all of these extensive analysis of this idea of border work, and how it then has this boomerang effect? Because whatever policing happens, whatever structures are built on what feels like the other side of the world, requires some kind of transformation within the country itself. If you're externalizing a certain kind of violence, what we've seen time and time again is that it requires a political and a social adjustment domestically. And the one that I really draw out in the paper is the impact of the racialized border on how the society in question views what we would call the far right. How this normalization of this extreme rhetoric of quote unquote invasion, how that then normalizes certain ways of speaking about entire groups of people that then become mainstreamed in the discourse and make certain political outcomes possible that would have been incomprehensible before that. But because we've normalized this idea of certain excesses being tolerable because they're being perpetrated against a population that has no civic voice, a population that doesn't vote, that doesn't pay tax, that doesn't have any leave it can exercise on the state, it becomes almost, the society almost turns a blind eye because it's like, well, that doesn't affect me. But the point that I really wanted to make is that it absolutely does affect you, because to make the space for that normalization within the society, something fundamental breaks within the society to make it possible. So, the foundational premises really are that, and really by extension, thinking about the way that ideas travel. very much tried to write a global report. The examples are taken literally from multiple corners of the world to show this really overarching idea that, ideas travel, that what becomes normalized in one part of the world gets disseminated in other parts of the world through various practices, either through institutional practices, how one institution relates to another institution, how, for example, the World Bank relates to national governments, how the EU might relate to an African government, how all of these institutions are interconnected, and ideas that are developed in one part of the world deployed uncritically in another part of the world can create significant issues. And so setting up this idea is looking about this, I try to look at this normalization of these border cultures, digital identities, this intersection, and then think about how this looks like at the extreme once again. The case studies of Afghanistan and the refugee populations in Uganda. Uganda has the second highest refugee population now in Africa. And it's a small country receiving people from all over the region. And instead of, well, what does this actually mean about the conflict systems that exist around Uganda? We're seeing some, technosolutionism coming out of that. Well, how do we pen these people in instead of what Uganda had done historically, which is how do we integrate these people into our society in a way that keeps them occupied until maybe they're able to go back to their countries of origin. And then, of course, the case of Afghanistan, which is probably the big red flag that we've witnessed as practitioners in this space, is this building of this elaborate digital identity system in Afghanistan that then becomes the property of the government, of a hostile government, of a government that's hostile to its female population, of a government that's hostile to its minority populations. What does it mean for a 360 ID system to be in possession of a government that has such hostile relationships with so many sectors of its population? I think this is an uncomfortable dilemma, but I think it's an important one. I think it's something that practitioners of digital rights everywhere are flagging in distinct ways that are reflective of their own geographical location. But I think that we're increasingly seeing that this is going to be a global problem. I've given multiple examples in the report, but I really wanted to show how this, this dilemma arises, and at the extreme, the kind of challenges that it places on the table. And it will not be a national challenge, it will be an international challenge, because the systems, if the technology is built in one part of the world and deployed uncritically on the other part of the world, well, who is accountable for that? Who is responsible? At what point is it the government? Is it the company that built it? Because the governments are not building these things in-house. Is it the government that deploys? Is it the multilateral institution that signs the financial agreement that makes the technology transfer possible? These are all key digital governance questions that we are increasingly having to contend with. And I think what the report does is to try and take a step back from the practical policy questions to ask the deeper theoretical questions. So that if my main argument is that if we ask the right questions, we put ourselves in an excellent position to get the right answers. But to do that, to make sure that we're tabling the right questions, we have to take a couple of steps back and do this, ground sort of forming theoretical work, which is not easy to do when you work in the policy space. It's so much easier to do the work and to respond to the crisis as it emerges. But again, having been in the digital rights space for a long time, it's so much of what we do is reactive. So much of what we do is the problem arises, and then we try to scramble, we organize, we mobilize our communities, we try to get the legal space, we sue, and we do all of these things. And the report sort of takes the position of, well, what if we try to get ahead of the problem? What if we did a great job of addressing the dilemma in our foundational work so that we wouldn't have to be reactive down the pipeline, that we would be ready for whatever challenges emerged out of the pipeline, or ideally, we would avoid these challenges altogether. So overall, that's the context in which the report was produced and some of the key issues that I tried to put on the table. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to think deeply about these issues. And I think again, working at the intersection between academia and policy work, trying to do those things together was a fantastic challenge. And I just hope that it really creates an opportunity for both of these groups of people to continue to ask these deeper questions. I think academia has done a tremendous amount of work that policymakers should be aware of and should be engaging with and should be putting together, in our reports in our approaches, to the challenges that technology presents across our societies. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nanjala. A masterclass in summarizing a really substantive, interesting, and thought-provoking report. I do hope everyone will check it out. But I'm extremely excited to turn now to a conversation about both the report and the topic more broadly. And gratitude to you for helping us bring together such an illustrative panel. In bringing in two other people to this conversation. First, I want to introduce Muzui Aizeki, who's the executive director and founder of the Surveillance Resistance Lab, which is a think and act tank that builds research and networks of collaboration to take on the threat of surveillance at the nexus of state and corporate power. Muzui focuses on the intersections of criminal and migration control systems, and as a note, is the co-editor of a book that will be coming out shortly on border and technologies of violence. We are also joined by Petra Molnar, who is the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab at the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. Petra is a lawyer and anthropologist specializing in technology, migration, and human rights. She co-runs the Migration and Technology Monitor, which is a multilingual archive of work examining technological experiments at the border and incubating projects by refugees and people on the move, focusing on border surveillance. I don't know that I could describe a more useful and interesting combination of experiences and focuses for the conversation that Nanjala just laid the groundwork for. And I think one of the things that really came through in your presentation, Nanjala, is the degree to which there's this kind of silent shaping force that technology can often provide on society. And in that way, that which is silent and not recognized is sometimes the most dangerous. And so I wonder if we can start, and I'll pose this question first to Muzui and then to Petra. What is it that you're seeing globally? Are there trends internationally in how technology is being used in at the border or in migration management? And how, if any ways, has that changed in recent years that you think people should be aware of? Muzui.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and in conversation with Nanjala and Petra. I think one of the things that really, maybe I'll just tell a little bit of backstory, how I actually first knew about Nanjala's work is very much to this point that Nanjala raises about how ideas travel. And so I was doing organizing in New York City against an initiative to turn a municipal ID for mostly undocumented people in New York City into a digital ID. And, advocates had worked very hard to get to do the first iteration of this ID, which was as secure as it could possibly be. And we found out through a Twitter post that the city was moving forward with a plan to attach it to all sorts of financial services, to, make it a card that people would have to use for some city services, to use it on the subway, et cetera. And what I started to think about then was this idea of, Afghanistan is an interesting example of what, the US called their identity dominance, right? So when the US occupied Afghanistan, they said, the way that we're going to win is by capturing as much information on every single individual, and basically like collecting their iris scans, collecting their fingerprints, collecting their DNA. And this is the some of the biometrics that Nanjala's report refers to were transferred to the Taliban. But this idea that the way that states gain dominance over populations it wants to control is by collecting as much information about them as we can. Not we, as they can. And so I think in terms of your question, Rose, one of the things that we think a lot about is what we call digital infrastructures of control, right? So what is happening now is, not now, but over the past few decades, especially with the advent of technology, is an incredible amount of both data being gathered, collected, analyzed, shared, across states, across borders, but for what reason, right? And I think the thing that we have to really grapple with is this point that I think, Nanjala, the phrase in the report is border cultures as state anxiety, right? And this, how bordering itself has become such a both commonly held but expansive practice around the world, right? And to me, really, the question that we have to think about is like, what do borders do, right? And I think the report speaks to this, and our work is very much focused on bringing this up because it's become a kind of a reflex, right? I think about, to this point about border cultures and reflecting state practices, one of the most notable things that's happened over the past few decades, I think, is how effectively racialized criminalization and securitization operates as like a magic wand, right? To legitimate all sorts of state violence, decrease rights regimes, both domestically and across the globe, but very much on this idea of who is deemed to be a threat. Right. And this, like, the threat construction is as old as time. That's what legitimated, slavery. That's what legitimates colonialism. But I think in the way that it's now combined with border regimes and state control, in the United States, especially after the founding of the Department of Homeland Security, you have this combination of like very restrictive laws and an unbelievable amount of money, right, that's put towards this practice, and then a whole economy, right, the surveillance industrial complex, the border industrial complex, on top of the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex now all together, right? So it's logics, it's like ideologies, material tools, but legal regimes. And I think this is the thing that I'm very happy to be part of this conversation because like now is the time, right? It's advanced quite a bit. I think one of the things that always really strikes me is like how many walls have been built since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I think, I don't have the stats here somewhere, but I think when the Berlin Wall came down, there were 15. And as of 2018, there were at least 77, right? And we all know what these look like. We call them walls, right? Petra, I'm sure will speak to this. It's much more than that. And these are borders that go deep into countries and extend very far out, So I think just to end my point is like, in terms of what we're grappling with is it's a turning point here in terms of, I think how Nanjala really points out is like, authoritarianism is on the cusp. Some people are already there, right? But like it's on the cusp for many of us in countries that are thought of as democratic countries, but these are not practices that are reserved for only the far right. And I would just say that there's a lot of consensus globally among liberal democracies, among far right regimes, around some of the most cruelest practices, where death is seen as kind of both acceptable at a scale that is not okay. But also, to this last point, where you were saying, Nanjala, about asking the right question, the solution is always more punishment. The solution is always more exclusion, right? The solution is always more surveillance. Then we have to ask a different question. Thanks.
Thank you. So you made Nanjala very happy. You referenced the fact that there are practices happening in the United States that perhaps if folks had heard without the identifier of a country may have assumed were in other places in the world. Petra, I know that you spend a lot of time looking at some of these comparative examples globally, and certainly, the question of how technology is used at borders or in migration management is not ideologically bound, let's say. I'm curious what you've been seeing, and so we'll throw the same question to you. And what are the trends that you've been observing in the past set of years you think people should be paying attention to?
Thanks so much, Rose, and congratulations, Nanjala, on this really important contribution to the field. I think the report is so crucial because, like you were saying, it's an interdisciplinary intervention forcing us to look at some of the underpinning and the deeper questions that we have to ask. And thanks, Rose, for the question. I've really been privileged because over the last 6 years, I've had the ability to go to many different border sites. That's perhaps where my anthropology hat comes in. I do view comparison to be very useful to try and unravel these very complicated strands of power, technology, and these border practices that are really built on a violent system of exclusion. And being able to actually see the infrastructure that Mizue was telling us about firsthand is, I think it changes you fundamentally as a researcher and as a human being. Looking at, for example, the US-Mexico frontier, I mean, it's a site of so much technological experimentation, not only in terms of the kind of more traditional projects that we might be concerned about when it comes to the kind of surveillance dragnet that is created there through different smart border technology, but also these really outlandish, very dystopian projects that have been announced, such as robodogs, that are supposedly going to be running around this already violent, deadly border. I've also been based on and off around the fringes of Europe, which has been the site of so much violence in terms of boats capsizing still to this day in the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea, which again, is a site where technology could potentially be used for maritime rescue, but instead it is used to weaponize this watery graveyard, essentially, and be used as a way for border interdictions or illegal pushback operations instead of actually assisting people who are in need. And again, once again, another site of very dystopian projects, such as loud sound cannons, different blimps and surveillance equipment that extends into the sky. I think it's important to look at these examples from a grounded perspective, because often, I think a lot of this can seem very dystopic and very future oriented, but the reality is it's already on the ground. And what I've seen time and again, from US-Mexico to Europe to the Kenya-Somalia border to Palestine, where we were earlier this year, these spaces are testing grounds. They are deliberately opaque, they're discretionary, and they're kind of hidden away from public scrutiny because they then become these laboratories for high-risk experiments where people on the move don't have access to the same kind of rights that a citizen might, which Nanjala was telling us about already. And so again, it sets up this kind of expectation around which communities can be tested upon. And then these technologies, of course, start impacting others. The robodogs I mentioned. For example, the New York City Police Department proudly announced again this spring that somehow robodogs are going to be used for some sort of law enforcement purposes in the city. So it's not just at the border. And I think it's also important, again, to look at these deeper practices that underpin this, what Nanjala was calling the kind of border practice, because borders, of course, are a very violent construct. This is nothing new. Technology just reifies or sharpens some of the ways that borders have already been exclusionary and violent and racially motivated. And what's happening now is technologies are actually extending the border, both into the sky, kind of vertically, but also horizontally, through externalization practices, through incentivizing other countries to do the dirty work of the European Union and the United States, for example, through this growing use of tech. But one other area I also want to mention, for me, as someone who's kind of interested in the power behind all of this. The fact that, it is not just about the technology, but it is about the power players who are in this. It's important to always pay attention to the actors who are involved. The private sector, most importantly, really gets to normalize and set the stage in terms of what counts as innovation. Like, why are we developing AI lie detectors to test out on refugees and migrants and not using AI to root out racist border guards? Like, that is a clear normative choice that a powerful set of actors is making because, as Mizue already mentioned, there's a lot of money to be made in this. One of the most egregious examples for me was this tech startup where some 20-some-year-old tech bro from Silicon Valley decided it would be appropriate to equip drones with tasers. And his idea was that they would fly around the US-Mexico frontier and pick out people who were seemingly migrant looking. I mean, he got so much money for this. Why is that? Why is that even allowed, right? And I'll just end here. I think it's so disturbing when we start picking apart all these strands, again, of power and privilege and innovation and contestation. But we must remember that there are real people at the center of this, real communities who are already impacted by these violent technologies. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, you'll know that I'm a very reluctant lawyer at best, but I am still a lawyer. And I do also question, like, why is there so little law and governance around this? That is not an accident. It is deliberate because it allows states and the private sector to continue to experiment in ways that simply would not be allowed in other spaces. So we must pay attention to the silences. We must pay attention to the ways that these practices operate and what they also obfuscate. And reports like this are super important because they allow us to shed light on what is happening.
There we go. My mute button was wanting everyone to sit and take in what you just said. Thank you so much for that, Petra. I think one of the things that's really interesting in this conversation is kind of the double side that you could examine. You know, let's take technosolutionism first. There's even the question of, is the solution that technology puts forward in fact effective? Even if you were looking solely through the lens of, does it keep a border closed, or does it tell me if a terrorist is trying to cross a border to carry out an attack? Does it effectively achieve the objective that it was stated as deployed for the purposes of, even if you disagree with that objective? There's also, though, the question of how technology itself is fundamentally different than conceptions of what people believe to be hard borders. And so I think one of the interesting parts of it that we've talked about is that things that get tested and normalized in border contexts that have this legal wishy-washy space can end up then being transferred into the use in societies more broadly. And Nanjala, I'm curious if you can speak about, as you were doing your research, you know, what are some of the ways that you have seen that start to get normalized? And particularly with, I think you've mentioned a few times, you know, the flood of excitement over AI. Are there ways that you are, or things that you're particularly concerned about, that you've seen practices in some of these legally gray areas of borders getting moved into more traditional uses by governments or broader societies, even in democracies?
Sure. There was a lady who teaches a class. She teaches a class at Harvard at the Carr Center, who called her class, "To what problem is ChatGPT the solution?" And I just thought that was such a fantastic framing, because I think it illuminates so much of what we're talking about here. So, to what problem is putting refugees on ankle bracelets a solution? Is it that we don't think that people who are entitled to, who are migrants, who are refugees, are not entitled to freedom of movement? Is it that we think that already that they are criminals? And this idea has become normalized in the United Kingdom. It is normal to put refugees on ankle bracelets after they've already lost so much of their access to public funding, to public services, have already been constrained to living in specific neighborhoods, to living in specific regions. Now comes this extra layer of carcerality, that it's okay to put people on ankle bracelets. And this is one specific technology that's finding purchase in different contexts. Children who are considered to be, young minoritized children especially, who are considered to be troubled, who are considered to be there's a antisocial, that's the phrase that's used, the antisocial youth. I think this question really sort of leapt at me, because I think it really gets to the heart of some of the things that we're talking about. The AI question is another interesting one. And there is study after study after study that has shown that AI, lie detection, personality, it doesn't work. It's snake oil. It doesn't, you cannot tell whether a person is lying. You cannot program that into a computer. But there's also this other aspect where I look at the work of people like Timnit Gebru and Emily Bender, and thinking about this notion of stochastic parrots, is that the AI is coded on what has already gone in the past. And so if the bias is already coded into the data, the AI is only going to reproduce this bias further. One of the areas where this is completely stark is in visa status determinations. So when you apply for a visa in many countries these days, you're not actually dealing with a human being on the other end. I think the US has a law that requires human intervention at some point in the process. So you might speak to you will definitely speak to a representative of the embassy when you are at the embassy, but the decision on your visa has already been made. The person is really just trying to decide whether to reaffirm that decision, whether there's something else, that some more information that needs to be received. These refugee status determinations, we're seeing massive rejection rates from African refugee African student applications, not refugee applicants, student applications. That's where one area that's been studied in Canada, that the rate of rejection of African visa applicants is so dramatically different from what's happening in the rest of the world. And one of the key pivots that's been made in the Canadian visa status determination is the use of AI in the decision of use of, let's say, technology in the visa status determination process. So if the AI is already coded with the idea that African applicants, the rejection rate is already high for whatever reason, the AI isn't going to magically learn something new. This idea of that Bender and Gebru sort of put on the table is that we have to let go of this idea that AI does and AI thinks and AI hallucinates. AI is data. It's a lot of data that's been produced to ask, to produce certain kind of questions and certain kind of answers, but it's just data. It is a reflection of whatever it is that it was trained on. And so this is one aspect that I think is really important to pay attention to on the border. And I'm glad to hear that there's a lot of people who are starting to do research on this issue. And I hope that the idea of technosolutionism sort of can illuminate some of the challenges that underlie this issue. It's not just about more efficiency at the border. It is, if we are already coded for certain identity politics, if we were already coded to reject certain groups of people, if the system was already coded to reject, single young Muslim men for refugee status application, which is a very, very alarming yet repeatedly seen sort of practice, throwing AI at that is not going to make the border less coded for that racism. It's not going to fix that issue. That's something that has to be a product of political will, of social intention. It has to be one of these deeper questions. And so that's one area that I think it echoes a pattern that we've seen in policing more broadly. Policing has faced numerous challenges about encoded bias and bias being normalized against certain groups, certain individuals, and things like that. And this is a practice that we're seeing sort of a recurring theme at the border. But I think it really comes down to that question for me is, well, what is it that you see as the problem here that you're solving for? And again, I really want to put on the table that the opposite of technosolutionism is not technophobia. The opposite of technosolutionism is not no technology ever. No, the solution is if we want to have all of these structures and institutions and things like that, then we have to be prepared to do the work to make sure that it is responsible development, that we're not just thinking about the next 5 years or the next 3 years, but we're thinking about the next 20 years and the next 50 years and the next 100 years. And that is really what I think needs to be reaffirmed constantly to policymakers is we're not looking at short-termism. We're looking at what kind of future do we want to live in? What kind of societies do we want to live in the long term? I hope I've answered your question.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm continuing to have issues with my mute button. I was hoping that you kind of brought up the question of like, what do we do about it then, looking into the long term? And Petra, I think it was you when we were chatting a bit beforehand that raised, in the context of the, EU just passed an AI Act, which of course we have yet to see the full text of, but people have been following closely for quite some time. And while everyone was focusing a great deal on what seems like an unending list of priorities and questions and societal needs and protections, you had mentioned that there were some elements of what we believe to have been finalized that perhaps kind of makes the point that the border or technology at the border tends to be a giant loophole, let's say. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about what you've been following in that process and where they landed, as well as what the implications might be.
Yeah, thanks, Rose, and thanks for also mentioning that it's not a final text yet. I mean, it's still going through the kind of final machinations before it is released to the public. But last Friday, maybe it was the Friday before, I don't know where the time is going these days. It was announced that this kind of landmark deal was reached. And for those of you who might need a little bit more context, the EU AI Act is an interesting piece of lawmaking because it will essentially be the first kind of regional attempt to govern something as amorphous and broad as artificial intelligence. So it is a really interesting piece of law to pay attention to. And full disclosure, I've been part of this coalition of academics and civil society that's been trying to push policymakers to think broadly and beyond what the text, the proposed text was even years ago when it was first announced, to really try and get more protections for people on the move into the act. If you're interested, you can check out the Protect Not Surveil coalition website. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it's been less than successful because migration is such a politically, complicated area in the EU and everywhere that even when we did have some buy-in from policymakers on issues such as using predictive analytics for border interdictions, we really wanted a ban or a moratorium on technologies like that. AI lie detectors at the border, different risk assessments for individuals going through the process. Once again, the concern is that because of these loopholes that are in the act, most importantly under grounds of national security, border projects will once again kind of slip in. Now, there is a kind of a graduated risk analysis that's built into the act. And so border technologies, or at least some, will hopefully continue to fall under what's called a high risk category. But once again, it's not a ban. It's not a red line. We are still somehow, I guess, as a society, okay with using, all sorts of unregulated tech at the border because, again, these loopholes are there for a reason. And what's also really interesting, and for those of you who are keeping a close eye on this, I would also encourage you to take a look at the recently released strategy that Frontex, the European Union's border force, put out on AI. And we were talking about this a little bit before, and Nanjala was the one who actually encouraged me to take a closer look at this. And what's really disturbing here is Frontex's strategy of using predictive analytics, of AI, of all sorts of different tools is kind of in direct contravention of what rights groups were asking for the EU Act to do. And why would that happen? Well, because it opens up avenues for potential strategic litigation, for example, in the future. So it's no accident, right, that the European Union's border force gets to set the stage and say, no, we need to use AI for these so-called legitimate purposes, in quotes, while the act itself, of course, then allows for these loopholes to continue. So again, what could have been a much stronger rights protecting and human rights centered piece of lawmaking, one that actually drew some red lines under this really egregious use of technology for border enforcement, border interdiction, prediction of movement, and then using that, of course, to weaponize different types of activities by Frontex and by different national bodies such as the Hellenic Coast Guard, which has also been in the news. It once again allows for this kind of unbridled use of technology to continue. And, of course, there's still a little bit of hope that maybe in the final text there will be some recognition of this. But given the kind of tenor of the conversation, I unfortunately am not very hopeful.
Thank you. And certainly, in the United States, there's a process ongoing right now to determine, after the White House released its executive order and what's called OMB guidance on the use of artificial intelligence within the powers that the executive branch has. There's a national security memo that will be drafted separately to determine some of these questions of what counts as a national security exception. How far does a dual use purpose go or not? And so these are very live issues that I think every government is grappling with. Which is why it's important both to be reminded of some of the things we're talking about and how technology gets leveraged to surveil and understand where people are going and what they're doing. We often think about that in the context of, let's say, the example of, the Chinese Communist Party's kind of pretty significant system of surveillance for political control. What's jarring is when you start seeing some of those same practices and technologies leveraged by democracies in similar ways, but targeted towards the stated objective of the danger of migration and human mobility. Mizui, I'm curious if you can share a little bit. I know that I can say, as an American, many of us during the, Muslim ban and that very fraught period of time where the US legal system was getting pushed to the edges, we were all surprised to learn the degree to which, for instance, rules about how far the border counts as within US territories goes. And what that would mean then for someone who has a cell phone, even if you're an American citizen, walking into these effectively lawless spaces. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit about what, if you're an American citizen, what are the ways that some of these practices are unthinkingly being moved into the general management of movement and technology, and how are decisions that might be made at the border right now, as the White House and civil society groups are actively debating where to come down on national security directives around the AI issue. What are some of the things you think people practically should be aware of about the ways in which the border and decisions around the border impacts them, even if they are in fact citizens?
I think maybe just taking it in a really meta way, it's a little bit like the report asks us to think about is like, what kind of world do we want to live in, right? Like if we think it's okay to have these hierarchical rights regimes, like I think we have to really grapple with what does that mean? Like, what does it mean when half the world only has 2% of the world's wealth? And we talk about these companies, like we could all name people now who are richer than most countries in the world, right? Jeff Bezos and was that not Zuckerberg? And I think part of what I would say is like kind of back to this point of really, if we want democracy, we have to understand how power is circulating. And so, I think to me, this idea of like citizenship, it's like the very fundamental rights regime that separates people from the very settlement of the United States, right? To say you actually belong here and you don't, right? You have a full right. You have a right to vote. You have a right to own land. You have a right not to be enslaved. And then the rest of you, right, that we deem to be the other, I think that's the fundamental thing that I think we would want people to grapple with, because these are the ways in which since the beginning of time, states have been basically given the ability to marginalize, oppress, repress people. And so I think that's my very broad answer to that point. But the other thing that I think we have to grapple with, even since it's the beginning of time, it's historically, it hasn't been the way that it is now, in the sense that it is so the scale of it and the way that it's grabbed hold in terms as a way of governance, right? And I think this is what Petra's talking about, Nanjala is talking about. It's like, and so when people have their DNA collected in Afghanistan because they're occupied by the US military, right? And then people are coming to the United States without legal status, and they're having their DNA collected by the US government, and it's populating a DNA database. Like, I think one thing to think about is like, when this raises like, raises the bar, lowers the bar for what becomes acceptable state practice, that I would say is a big question to us. But I just want to say one other thing. I know we're running out of time, but I really think this idea of like how to make visible what's happening, it's not technology, right? It's the power systems that circulate behind it. So if we can understand innovation, right, kind of what Petra was talking about, innovation at borders being, you cannot separate it from militarism. You can't separate it from, racial capitalism. You can't separate it from policing, right? So it's like, if we want real innovation, what do we have to put at the center of it, right? Human rights? Like, can we try that as a way of thinking about what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? So I will end there, and thank you.
Thanks, Nanjala. Oh,
I can't believe we've been doing this for almost 3 years now, and I still forgot to unmute. I just wanted to just reaffirm that it's two pieces of it. It's at the center, what is at the center of the systems that we're building? What are the questions that we're trying to answer? But also in practical terms, I think one of the things that's come out of the US that has been a huge red flag for many years is the automated tracking system. And I make a mention of this in the report, which it gives the Department of Homeland Security the ability to create personalized risk assessments of people who cross US borders, including US citizens. Now, that might seem like a very, even if you're not a human rights practitioner, even if you're not a lawyer, you might look at that and think, yeah, that seems like a legitimate policing thing, but it's really not. It's the kind of thing that very quickly slips into dystopia because risk is subjective. And what level of risk you present is always going to be relative to your relationship to the state. For many people who are part of populations that have always had an antagonistic relationship with the state, this is a huge vulnerability. I mentioned earlier the Muslim criminalization of young Arab men, young Arab men. I had the privilege of clerking on a project a number of years ago that was looking at the experiences of young Muslim men sort of leaving, well, I wouldn't say Muslim, I'll say young Arab men, because some of them were Christians, who left Syria after the outbreak of war in Syria. And one of the things that was happening was that even in Lebanon, even in Jordan, these young men were not being allowed to cross the border because they were seen as risks, terrorism risks, as risks to the state just because of their identities. There was no further analysis. There was no further, it was simply because they were young men, they were unaccompanied, and they had showed up at the border trying to escape a war. Now, the question is, if you stay in Syria, you could be conscripted. You could be subjected to all kinds of violence, but you cross the border and you're being subjected to the very specific kind of violence that emerges from these border cultures that criminalize, based on aggregate data. It's not that people have done a survey of every single, young Arab man in Syria and found, well, here's the probability. No, it's really based on subjective interpretations of risk. So when we think about things like the ATS and how it, provides these kinds of risk assessments, by the way, that could be stored for up to 40 years. So for 40 years, all of these things are following people, and you'll see people talk about the SSSS designation on their boarding passes, which means that they are always 100% subjected to enhanced screening at the border. That's the kind of stigma that can follow a person. It not only makes you feel alienated from your state, you will never be fully, it makes you feel like you're not fully integrated to the state. But then also, even as a person, what we've seen with the deterioration of democracy all over the world in the last 5 years is that at any point, if the nature of the state changes and our relationship to the state changes, then we are all vulnerable to these risk assessments that see us as potentially presenting a risk, even when we're just existing. For people who have worked in civil society in the global south, this is something that we contend with all the time. You could just be a lawyer who happens to be a lawyer who believes in human rights, and your government decides that you are a threat. And the use of technology, this was one of the Pegasus cases. We had a man who boarded a plane in Belgium and was heading to Mozambique, and security forces, the Rwandese security forces, were waiting to meet him in Mozambique, and he was arrested in Mozambique for his work agitating for democracy. The nature of risk, that we present is always subjective and always fluid and always changes. So what we need, as Muzuri was saying, is to really think about the harder questions at the heart of it, because that shifting of the orientation of why we're building this technology, why we're deploying it at the border, will hopefully lead us to a place where we think, well, we've seen how it affects these vulnerable people who don't have the same access to power that we assume the end user does, that we don't want to deploy it because the risks are just too great for the general population. And I also just want to close by saying that this is something that happens, in this case, we're talking about digital technologies on the border. This is a challenge that arises with digital technologies in all contexts. Who we assume the end user is reflective of how we imagine digital technologies should work. Do we see that the social media user could be a young woman who wants to report harassment that she's enduring because she's a woman? Do we see that the user of a mobile phone could be someone who doesn't want to be vulnerable to surveillance because every single interaction that they have online is being tracked for the purposes of advertising? We don't imagine vulnerabilities. People who build technologies, as Missouri was saying, don't imagine vulnerabilities when they're building them. And we keep ending up in these rights black holes whereby law policy is always trying to catch up because we weren't present when the things were being built. So maybe if we ask the right questions, then we wouldn't have to be in every single room kind of telling people, hey, people are going to get hurt if you don't think about these questions more clearly.
Thank you, Nanjala. It's an excellent wrap up. And so I'll just say, as the host here at a foreign policy think tank, one of the things that comes through so clearly is that on issues of technology and frankly of the movement of humans, which is inherently connected as well, that it is impossible to assume that anything that is built or decided here will work in other contexts and vice versa, and not examining that, asking questions about that, or ensuring that where we put our money, our time, and our energy is not unintentionally, and I hopefully not intentionally, driving undemocratic outcomes elsewhere and empowering authoritarian or anti-democratic leaders to suppress speech, to suppress opposition, to do all sorts of things that I think a broader community has an easier time agreeing on for some reason, are things we don't want in our societies. That this report is a really important contribution to help people understand the ways in which silos we construct around these questions and these policy issues don't exist in the real world. And better policy solutions, whether it's that you actually care about ensuring your country is safe from terrorism, whether you care about ensuring the children fleeing war are able to come to safety and have futures, whether you care about human rights existing globally. All of those things give you good reason to read this report and to think deeply about the implications of choosing technology as the solution rather than a tool towards societal solutions for worlds that we want to see. So gratitude to all of you for joining us for this discussion. Nanjala, for choosing the topic, for writing this report and forcing us to think deeply, to my colleagues at the Atlantic Council for helping to shepherd this forward, to Ambassador Anne-Marie Engtoft-Melgaard for joining us and supporting work like this from a government perspective, which is just as important as those of us in civil society asking these questions. I hope people will engage with this. You can find more on our work at dfrlab.org. You can find us on all of the social media places you could possibly want to at DFRLab. Thank you so much for joining us today.